This is not a typical message that I would preach on a Sunday, but I want to talk to you in a very, very rational way. I want to appeal to your mind this morning about why I believe that Jesus is no longer dead, why I believe that Jesus Christ is alive. You see, friends, there is nobody in the world who will argue that there was a man named Jesus Christ. The atheist will agree with it. The agnostic will agree with it. The Christian will agree with that fact. Jesus Christ did exist. He lived somewhere between the years of 5 A.D. and 5 B.C. and 35 A.D. We know that's true. We also know that he was crucified. That's a fact. We know that historians have been able to confirm that this man named Jesus Christ, who was a great teacher, who had a great following, and somehow has been able to gather a following 2,000 years later, this man was actually crucified. We know that he was placed in a grave, the grave of Joseph of Arimathea. And we know that to be true. But there's another story, and the story is that 3 days later, this Jesus rose from the grave. That he's no longer in the tomb. That you can't go to a grave site and find the bones of Jesus Christ. And perhaps that's the problem. Perhaps this is the issue that needs to be most considered. You see, most people will believe that Jesus existed. There are people who are even atheists who would grab hold of his teachings, who would grab hold of the things that he presented and say, those are good teachings. But if you believe that Jesus was more than a man, if you believe that Jesus rose from the grave, something has to happen inside of you. You see, if Jesus really did rise from the dead, he was more than just a mere man. He was more than just a good teacher. He was more than just a kind individual who had some interesting supernatural things follow him. If Jesus Christ actually rose from the dead, if he's no longer in the grave, then friends, you've got to seriously consider whether or not he is who he said he was, the Son of God. The Son of God. And so this morning I want to look at that. I want to look at the arguments about Jesus rising from the dead. There was a man in history that historians have confirmed existed. His name was Saul, later on to be known by the name of Paul. And he shares these words in his letter to the Corinthian church, found in chapter 15, verses 3 to 6. He says these words, "For what I received, I passed on to you, as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Peter and then to the 12. And after that he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers at the same time, most who are still living, though some have fallen asleep." This man named Saul, later to be called Paul, was a man who had persecuted the church. A devout Jew, a Jew who had studied underneath Gamaliel, one of the most famous rabbis of that day. A man who was so bothered by this new movement called Christianity, this following the way. He was so bothered that he would do anything in his ability to try to stop this message of the Jesus, of the Son of God, of the King of the Jews. He would do anything in his abilities to try to make that story come to an end. And yet something takes place. It doesn't seem like this passage belongs to that man. Something changes in his mind. Something changes in his heart. He comes to a place where he believes that the story about Jesus is true. He comes to a place where he believes that Jesus not only is the one who taught the good news, isn't only the one who performed miracles, but is the one who went to the cross, and he is the one who rose from the grave. This man who was so opposed to the story of the resurrection now is a man who is proclaiming it. How is that possible? How is it possible that someone can have such a mental 180 take place in their lives? The truth of the matter is that Paul would tell you, if he were alive today, that he had an encounter with this Jesus who had died on a cross, this Jesus who was put into a grave. He had an encounter with him face to face. And so for Paul, he was absolutely convinced that Jesus Christ is no longer dead, but that he's alive. Now for you and I, that might seem like an interesting story, because it's okay for somebody else to believe in something if they've had some kind of weird experience. But for most of us, we've never had a face-to-face with Jesus Christ. We've never had that moment on some road where we've seen this shining light and come face-to-face with this man named Jesus. And so for many of us, we have to wrestle it out mentally. Is Jesus really who he said he was? Is he really the one who went to the cross and rose from the grave? This morning, what I'd like to do is present some arguments to you. I'd like to present some arguments that refute that Jesus rose from the grave. Because for many people, they just cannot buy into this story. They cannot buy into the fact that a man went to a cross, then was put in a grave, and 3 days later came back to life. And so they have some arguments. The first argument that people would have is this, is that Jesus was not really dead. In the 18th and 19th century, there was a famous rationalist named Schleiermacher. And Schleiermacher had this swoon theory that he presented. The idea was that Jesus had gone to the cross and that he had swooned or fainted. And when the soldiers went to see whether or not he was still alive, he appeared to be dead, but he had really just fainted. And so the theory began to spread throughout the world, and many people would refute the fact that Jesus Christ is alive today because they would say that when Jesus came off the cross, he was still alive, that he was still alive when he was put into the grave, and so it was very easy for him to escape from that tomb, that he was never, ever dead. Interesting theory, interesting argument. There's some problems with it, though. The first argument, or the first problem with this argument, the swoon theory, this idea that Jesus was still dead or was still alive when he was put into the grave, was that these Roman soldiers were experts in crucifixion. These were not just random thugs that just took Jesus Christ and put him on a cross. The Roman soldiers that were used to crucify Jesus knew exactly how to go through the process, not just to ensure that somebody was placed on a cross, but they were experts in ensuring that this individual who was placed on the cross would die. There was no possible way that they could not make that happen. The second thing that I have a problem with this argument is the fact that if these Roman soldiers did not fulfill the crucifixion, if they did not make sure that the person, the criminal that was placed on the cross died, then these Roman soldiers themselves would have to face the death penalty. Now friends, I don't know about you, but if someone said, you've got to do this action or you're going to die, I'd make sure I did the action as well as possible. And so when they placed Jesus Christ on the cross, they weren't being flippant with it. They knew that if this man did not die, if he did not die, that they would have to face the death penalty themselves. But then there's the issue of what Jesus had to go through. The whip that was placed across his back, the 39 cattails, with pieces of bone and pieces of rusted metal, pieces of rock that would be slashed across his back, and as the tips of those whips would grab hold of his skin, they would tear apart his flesh 39 times. And they would place a crown of thorns that would go deep into his flesh and into his skull. They would beat him and hit him in the face and mock him. Then they would lay down this heavy cross. And they would place the nails, the thick iron nails, somewhere in the middle of his wrists on both sides to hold him up on the crossbeam. In this instance, they would crucify his feet. And they would do something so different from other crucifixions. You see, in most crucifixions, they would place something called a sedile in place, a seat. And so that the person who was crucified would have moments of reprise, moments where they were able to sit down, but not Jesus. No, the Roman soldiers knew that the next day was the Sabbath, and if Jesus didn't die that day, then they would have to take him off the cross because of the law, and they'd have to wait for a couple days before he was fully dead. And so they want to ensure that the man who they placed on the cross, the man that they were responsible, that he faced the most excruciating pain, that he faced the worst circumstances so that he would be guaranteed of dying. And so as they placed those nails into his feet, they arched his feet in such a way that his knees would be bent, his arms would be spread, and he would have no reprise. He would have no moment to sit down on that sedile seat. He'd have no moment to rest. He would have to hold himself up after all that he had went through. It was absolutely impossible that he could survive such terrible torture. And in fact, you don't need to believe a preacher. I've got my education in theology. But you should consider the facts from the Medical Society. March 21st, 1986, from the Journal of the American Health Association. This is what they write. Top-notch medical journal. It says, clearly the weight of historical and medical evidence indicates that Jesus was dead before the wound to his side was inflicted, and supports the traditional view that the spear thrust between his right ribs probably perforated not only the right lung, but also the pericardium and heart, and thereby ensured his death. Accordingly, interpretation based on the assumption that Jesus did not die on the cross appeared to be at odds with modern medical knowledge. Friends, this idea, this argument that Jesus was still dead, or still alive, this argument that Jesus just merely fainted, that maybe his disciples had, when they had placed the sop on the end of that stick to give Jesus some reprieve from his thirst, that maybe they had drugged him. This idea that Jesus wasn't dead when he came off the cross is irrational. There's no possible way it makes sense. And so if you want to buy into that argument that Jesus wasn't dead when he went to the tomb, that he was still alive, and that this man was behind a 2.5-ton stone after he faced all this harsh torture, and this Jesus in the tomb being whipped 39 times, having his hands driven into a cross, having his feet driven into a cross for hours upon hours, facing pain, that type of man, in his utmost weakness, was able to go into a tomb, still alive, and push a 2.5-ton stone. If you want to believe in that, you believe in that. But to me, that doesn't make sense. To me, it says, I believe Jesus is alive. I believe Jesus rose from the dead. You see, there was the argument that Jesus was not really dead. The second argument was that the body of Jesus was stolen. That when the body was placed into that tomb, that the disciples want to continue on this movement, that they want to expand the story, that even though Jesus was dead, they felt some obligation to the man they had followed, and so they came up with an incredible plot. That they would sneak in the middle of the night near the third day, and that they would steal the body of Jesus Christ. And so many people in this world believe that the story of Jesus' resurrection is merely explained by the fact that Jesus' body was stolen. Interesting theory. It's interesting based upon a number of things that I have problems with. First of all, when they got to the tomb on the third day, they walked in and they saw Jesus' grave clothes laid out on the place where the body was supposed to be. I'm not much of a criminal, which you're very thankful for, being the preacher today. But I do know this, that if I were a criminal and I was going to steal a body, I wouldn't take the time to take the body's clothes off. I wouldn't take the time to get the body undressed and carry a naked corpse to the street. I wouldn't do that. If I was going to steal a body to create some kind of story, I would leave the clothes on the body and I would get out of there as quickly as possible. But many argue that no, they stole his body and they decided to take a few. Why don't we just take off Jesus' clothes and leave it here, just to create some confusion? Doesn't make any sense. Doesn't make any sense at all. Secondly, the truth of the matter is the disciples just weren't that type of group. I mean, you got to think about this. These disciples, the ones who are going to go face the guards and try to sneak past the Roman soldiers to steal a body. I mean, in Jesus' last few hours, Jesus is trying to pray, and these disciples, they keep falling asleep. They're not that type of group. They're just not there mentally. And then the soldiers come in to arrest Jesus, and they all start freaking out except for Peter. And Peter doesn't know what to do because he's just a rambunctious individual who just acts randomly. He pulls out his sword, cuts off the high priest's servant's ear. And then Jesus heals the high priest's servant's ear and takes the sword away. And the next thing you know, all the disciples are gone. Oh yeah, these brave men. 12 individuals, all so brave. They're escaping. That's the group that stole the body of Jesus from the Roman soldiers. Doesn't make any sense. I mean, these guys aren't even emotionally fit. They're hiding off in some homes. I mean, Peter is so emotionally unstable that he's sitting by a fire and someone asks him if he had seen, or if he's one of the followers of Jesus. And Peter starts to say, no, it wasn't me. No, it's somebody else. Wasn't it you? No, it wasn't me. And the little girl says, hey, I think you were one of the guys that followed him. And he begins to curse and swear. I mean, you want to talk about the brave people who stole the body of Jesus? It doesn't seem to make sense that these disciples would be the ones. But then what's interesting is in Matthew chapter 27, verses 62 to 66. If you just want to turn there quickly. Matthew chapter 27. It's interesting that this grave isn't just left alone. Verses 62 to 66 says this. Then the high priest stood up and said to Jesus, are you not going to answer? 27 verses 62 to 66. The next day, the one after preparation day, the chief priest and the Pharisees went to Pilate. Sir, they said, we remember that while he was still alive, that the deceiver said, after 3 days, I will rise again. So give the order for the tomb to be made secure until the 3rd day. Otherwise, his disciples may come and steal the body and tell the people that he has been raised from the dead. So they're even thinking about it. They're even thinking about this theory that Jesus is going to steal the body. It says that he's going to be raised from the dead. That's the story they're going to tell. This last deception will be worse than the first. So Pilate says this, take a guard. Go and make the tomb as secure as you know how. So they went and made the tomb secure by putting a seal on the stone and posting the guard. So even the people of the day, even the leadership of the day, they know that this theory might come about because they've heard some words about Jesus, and so they begin to put some security in place. And so is it possible that they stole the body from Jesus? Is it possible that they stole the body of Jesus? The first thing that I think about from this passage is the fact that they've sealed the grave. We probably don't understand it. We think that maybe they just put the stone there, but what actually happened is they took this very strong rope and they put it around the back of the stone and they tied it towards the front, and they put this wax seal in front of the rope, tying it together with this impression of the Roman signet in place. Now, friends, that may not mean anything to you, but the person who broke this seal would be guilty of the death penalty. And so for them to steal the body of Jesus meant they had to break the seal. For them to break the seal meant that they would face the death penalty if they were caught. You got these guys who are scared of the soldiers coming to arrest Jesus. You got Peter who's swearing that he doesn't know Jesus. These are the individuals who are willing to break a seal to steal a body, whereby they could face the death penalty. Doesn't seem to make sense. Then Paul, we find in the past, I just slipped over to one of my next points. If the Romans really believed this, they would have arrested these disciples right away. If they really thought that these guys stole the body of Jesus, they would have gone looking for Jesus. They would have arrested them, and then they would have crucified them because that was the death penalty. What's even more perplexing to me is the idea that the disciples, these 12 fishermen and tax collectors and just random group of individuals, would be able to sneak by the Roman soldiers to steal the body. That doesn't seem to make sense. Because, friends, if a Roman soldier fell asleep on his night shift, what would take place is that that person who would be found guilty of falling asleep would be stripped of their clothes and they would be burned alive. That was the punishment. And so if you're a Roman soldier, you are not falling asleep at night. You are doing everything in your ability. You're having as many Red Bulls as you can find. I mean, you're doing everything. You're pumping yourself with caffeine because you do not want to fall asleep, because you know that if you fall asleep, that you are going to be stripped and you're going to be burned alive. And so if that story were true, these disciples came and stole the body, that meant that somebody had to have fallen asleep. Truth was that there was more than just a one somebody. There was a group of individuals who were there, many Roman soldiers, because they were supposed to guard it to the best of their ability. And if they couldn't determine who was guilty for the body being stolen, what would happen is they would take some lots, some dice, and they would toss them. And wherever the lots landed, that was the individual who was chosen to be stripped and burned alive. So you're one of the group of people who are guarding this tomb. And if your buddy is starting to fall asleep, you know that you may be the one that the lot lands on, and so you're waking each other up. You're rubbing shoulders. You're making sure that everybody is there. You're slapping water on your face. You're singing songs. You're doing whatever it takes to make sure that the people who are around this tomb, guarding this tomb, that they're awake, because you want to make sure that nobody falls asleep, so that you don't have a chance of being part of the death penalty lottery. You want to make sure that everybody's awake. And so this idea that Jesus Christ, that his body was stolen, it doesn't seem to make sense. It doesn't seem to fit with rationale. Then there's the stone. And I know in all the pictures we see, in all the Easter presentations, it's this nice big round stone that's just kind of just moved over very, very easily, like one of my kids could just move it over with one hand. But friends, what they would do is they would take a 2.5-ton stone, and it would be on a decline. And so it would start up here, and because the thing was so heavy, they would have a piece of stick that would push, that would just jostle this stone just enough so that it would roll down into place right in front of the tomb. You got this group of soldiers around the tomb, and now they've got to push the stone uphill, up on this incline. They've got to push a 2.5-ton stone on an incline to steal Jesus' body with the soldiers around. If you've got a way to figure out how to do that, could you come and tell me? Because that just doesn't seem to make sense. It doesn't seem to make sense that that's a rational explanation. That the disciples had this way to dupe all the soldiers, had the way to push this stone up so the soldiers couldn't see and steal Jesus' body. Truth of the matter is, friends, this idea of Jesus' body being stolen doesn't seem to make sense. And even for those who would argue that maybe the Roman soldiers stole the body, that pushes me over the edge, because once the story gets going out about Jesus being the risen Lord, surely if they stole the body, they would find that body and present it as proof that their story was wrong. No, this idea that Jesus' body was stolen is absolutely irrational. And if that's your proof, if that's what you think, and that prevents you from accepting that Jesus rose from the dead, friends, I got to ask you to reconsider. So Jesus' body was dead when it came off the cross. Jesus' body wasn't stolen. But the last major argument about the resurrection has to do with the story being fabricated. That these disciples were just genius at coming up with a great story. That they had sat down and said, now that our master, our rabbi has been put to death, we just need to come up with some great story that will explain why he died. And then 3 days later, when the body's gone, they said, well, okay, we got to figure out a way to let people know why this has happened. We got to come up with something incredible. How about he's risen from the dead? How about we come up with a great story? Yeah, that sounds like a great idea. Let's come up with this great story that will just create a swelling of followers. The problem with them creating a story, fabricating a story, starts off with the witnesses. Because if you follow the story from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you find that the witnesses that they use are interesting witnesses. You see in Matthew says that the first person at the tomb was Mary Magdalene, and the other Mary. And then in Mark it says that it was Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome. Then in Luke he says that it was the women, and then later on in the passage he says it was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the other women. And lastly in John he says that it was Mary Magdalene. Now you're probably sitting here in the 21st century saying, I don't understand. What's the problem with this story? What's the problem with the witnesses? In Jewish culture, a woman's testimony was never admissible. If a woman shared some kind of proof about some situation, that story, that proof would never, ever hold up in court. If you're going to find a witness, and friends, I apologize, I'm not trying to be sexist, I'm just telling you about Jewish culture. But if you were trying to find a good witness, you didn't find a woman. You found a man. Because women's testimonies were less than accurate. And so if you're going to create a story, if you're going to fabricate some story that's going to try to transform the world, why in the world would you choose women to be the first witnesses? It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense that they would choose Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, Joanna, Salome, and the other women. If you're going to choose witnesses, your first witnesses, the very first people to see the resurrected Lord, you choose a man. Unless it's true. Unless it's true. So there's the issue of the first witnesses. Secondly, the second issue I have about them fabricating a story is, how far are you willing to go with your fabricated story? I don't know if you've ever told a lie. Most of you probably haven't, but I have. I know I may look holy, but I've told lies many times. And not many times. I mean, but a few moments. I'll never forget being a kid. I'll never forget this big refrigerator box downstairs in my basement that was calling my name. And my mom had washed some blankets and put them over this box to let them dry. And I remember her telling me, do not jump on that box. I'm trying to let the blanket dry. And they were upstairs, Mom and Dad. I remember walking over, and I could hear it calling my name. I mean, the box, it had this loud voice. Come and jump on me, Jeff. Come and jump on me. And I'm just like a 5-year-old kid, and I come over to this box, and I try to jump up on top of it, and it's too high. I mean, it's a refrigerator box, and so then I think, if I can get some bounce from the Chesterfield, and so just try to bounce up, and I'm hitting the box, and all of a sudden I could hear my mom and dad walking through the kitchen, and they're heading towards the stairs. So I turn around, sit on the Chesterfield like a good little boy, looking at this blank TV screen. Mom and Dad come down, and they say, hey, Jeff, what were you doing? I was just sitting here. Were you jumping on the box? No, I wasn't jumping on the box. Jeff, were you jumping on the box? Mom, I wasn't jumping on the box. Well, we heard some banging. Yeah. And friends, I can't remember what I said I was banging, but I just remember my mind was racing, trying to come up with some story. My mom says, were you kicking the Chesterfield? That's what I was doing, Mom. And she says, and she gets on the Chesterfield. My mom was so wise. She got on the Chesterfield under her stomach, and she begins to kick her feet furiously against the Chesterfield. I said, that's exactly what I was doing. And she says, okay, try it. Oh, boy. So I lay on my stomach, and I start to kick, and my little feet, I mean, it's little taps. This goes on for some time, and at some point, I just looked at my mom and my dad, and I just knew. I could only go so far with the lie. They knew that I was guilty. They knew what I had done. And I tried lying for a certain season, but eventually my lie caught up with me. If I'm a disciple and I'm going to create a story that's a lie, if I'm going to fabricate something, I got to ask myself, how far am I willing to go? At what point will I give in? Is there a point of surrender? Is there a point where I actually tell the truth? Consider this. These 12 disciples, they weren't just telling a story. They weren't just fabricating something. I mean, these 12 disciples, they faced some incredible moments. Let me read you what they went through. Peter was crucified upside down. He said, I'm not worthy to die in the same way as Christ. Andrew was crucified in Edessa. James the Great was beheaded. Matthew died a martyr in Egypt. Thomas was martyred by being thrust through with a spear in India. James was thrown down from the temple by the scribes and Pharisees. He was stoned, and then his head was beaten to death with a fuller's club. Jude was crucified in Edessa. John was banished to Patmos. Philip was crucified upside down in Hierapolis. And Bartholomew was crucified upside down in India. If I'm going to tell this story, I might lie for a certain season. But as they're pulling out the cross, and they're asking me to denounce my story, they're asking me to stop telling this message of Jesus Christ. As they're pulling out the sword to cut off my head, as they're showing me the way to Patmos, say you're going to be isolated for the rest of your life. as they're pulling out the sword, as the Pharisees have the one disciple at the top of the temple, ready to toss him, as I'm at these moments where my life is about to be ended, that's the point where the story stops. That's the point where the fabricated story stops. Okay, it's a lie. We made it up. But the truth of the matter is they didn't stop. They didn't give in. They didn't change their story because, friends, their story wasn't fabricated. It was true. If it was fabricated, they would have easily pulled back. They would have easily stopped sharing it. They would have easily confessed that they had made it up. But their story wasn't a lie. It was true. That's why they were willing to be crucified upside down. That's why they were willing to be beheaded. That's why they were willing to face death. Because, friends, it wasn't a lie. Then there's the other 500 witnesses that Paul talks about. I mean, it's common in this day to have visions of dead people. All kinds of people say, yeah, we had a vision of so-and-so, we had a vision of so-and-so, these dead individuals. But what added to the story of the vision was an empty tomb. You see, the visions were always of dead people, and every single vision could be coupled with an individual who was in the tomb still dead. But this story, this group of witnesses, these 500 people, they share visions that coincide with an empty tomb, not a dead person in a tomb, but an empty tomb. What's more is they begin to talk about interacting with this dead individual. They begin to talk about conversations with this dead individual. They begin to talk about him having meals with them. Now, friends, 500 people is a lot of people to keep one story straight. I mean, any of us who have kids, when we've watched even if you have 2 kids, and your 2 kids begin to concoct a story, you just pull them aside. You figure out which kid will cave first. And you put one kid in one room and one kid in another. You put a light on their head, turn off the rest of the lights in the room, and you begin to press them. And one kid's going to tell one story, another kid's going to tell another story. At some point, you're going to have an inconsistency. 500 people tell the same story. 500 witnesses tell the same story about the risen Christ. 500 people tell a story about this Jesus that they saw. It's the same story. There's no inconsistencies in it. These 500 witnesses. Paul was so certain of the story, he said to the Corinthian church, he says, if you don't believe me, you go find them. Because in that time, there was something called the Pax Romana, which was this peaceful season where you could travel in the Middle East. You could travel without any worries of any kind of harm coming to you. He says, this is the season where you can travel. You can find these 500 individuals. And if you'll go looking for them, you'll be able to have a conversation with these 500 individuals. And you will find out that their story is just as I've told it. I mean, if I'm making up the story, I'm not going to stand up and tell people, go talk to that person. You know, if Pastor Adam, who just left, if Pastor Adam and I, if we're making up some story and he's my cohort and he's got the other part of the lie, I'm not going to say, hey, if you don't believe me, go tell Pastor Adam. Go ask him. No, because I don't want you going to ask just in case there's some inconsistencies. But Paul says, hey, there's 500 people. Why don't you go find out from them yourselves? One last thing about these 500 witnesses. In this day and age, there was a set of rules when it came to stories. If the story was fictional, if it was untrue, then as the story was passed on, the person telling the story was able to adjust it. They were able to add parts and take away parts. It became your own story. And so a story would be passed on over and over and over again. And what might start off as a story about a boy with a little apple might end up with a story of a girl with a snake in her hands. I mean, you know it's like if you've ever played the telephone game where you start off with a sentence and then the person whispers the next sentence into the next person's ear, and by the end you get this incredibly different story. That's what was allowed with fictional stories. The factual stories had to remain consistent. You weren't allowed to add or take anything from them. And these 500 witnesses share the same story over and over and over again, never adjusting the details, never adding, never taking away, because they knew that this story was not a fictional story. It was fact. It was fact. And so this idea that the disciples created a story, it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense that they would create a lie. It doesn't make any sense. And if it's not a story, then I've got to believe that Jesus actually rose from the dead. He wasn't alive when he came off the cross. They didn't steal his body. And friends, they didn't fabricate the story. I've got to believe that Jesus is alive. I've got to believe that these arguments are false. And my mind has got to tell me that Jesus Christ is actually alive. But let me just quickly, and I'm almost done, but let me just quickly share 3 last ideas with you. The first idea has to do with the resurrection. You see, up to this point in Jewish culture, the resurrection was an accepted idea, but the idea that they believed was that the resurrection was at some future date. And when the resurrection took place, what would happen is that people would have resuscitated bodies. But these early believers talked about not resuscitated bodies, but transformed body. A transformed Jesus. A Jesus who was recognizable, but a Jesus who was able to walk and talk and walk through walls. Completely transformed. Who wasn't bound by the laws of nature. Now, in order to accept a idea that was contrary to what historical teachings had so often shared, what would need to take place would be years of debate and discussion. There would have to be many, many conversations about the idea that resurrection would look different from what had historically been taught. But immediately, the masses grab hold of the story of resurrection, of a transformed body, of a transformed Jesus, immediately, without debate, without discussion, against the cultural norms. Everybody buys in who accepts Jesus. Every new believer of the way, they say, we believe in a resurrected body that is transformed. Why would they go against the cultural norms of determining whether or not something was true? Because these individuals had encountered this living Jesus. They had encountered them. The reason why they didn't follow the process, the reason why they weren't willing to follow the process for this new thought about the resurrection was because they had experienced this living Jesus. Oh, but then there's the issue of Jesus being the Son of God. Following the tomb moment, we find the early followers of Jesus Christ beginning to worship him. They begin to praise him. They begin to fall on their knees. They begin to worship him in a way that was only reserved for God himself. And if any individual would ever do something like that, they would be guilty of blasphemy. But the early church bought hold of it right at the beginning, right after the 3rd day. They immediately began to worship Jesus, not as just a good teacher, not just as a miracle worker, but now as the Son of God. Their worship said, we believe he was more than a mere man. We believe that he was actually the Son of God, that he was actually God himself. And because of that, we're able to worship him. We're able to raise our hands before him. We're able to sing songs to him. We're able to fall on our knees before him. We're able to declare our praises to him. How is that possible? Why would they risk blasphemy? Because, friends, they had encountered the living Jesus. And when you've encountered the living Jesus, you are convinced that just a man stays on a cross. Surely just a man stays in a tomb. But somebody who comes out of a grave 3 days later is more than a man. He's the Son of God. He's the one who deserves to be worshipped. And they begin to do what no other Jew had done in the past. They give their worship to a person who walked upon planet Earth. The new thought about Jesus. Lastly, so interesting. Jesus predicted this. Jesus predicted that this was going to happen. Let me read you a few passages just as we close. Mark chapter 8, verse 31. It says, he then began to teach them the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. Then in Mark chapter 9, verses 30 to 32, it says, they left that place and passed through Galilee. Jesus did not want anyone to know where they were because he was teaching his disciples. He said to them, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. They would kill him, and after 3 days he will rise. But they did not understand what he meant and were afraid to ask him about it. And then in Mark chapter 10, verses 32 to 34, he says this, they were on their way up to Jerusalem with Jesus leading the way, and the disciples were astonished. And while those who followed were afraid, again, he took the 12 aside, and he told them what was going to happen to him. We are going to Jerusalem, he said, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles, who will mock him and spit on him, flog him, and kill him. And then he says, 3 days later, he will rise. Okay? For all the rational people in this place, I can predict my death. I can predict that if I do enough things that I might be the target for an assassination. Like every now and then I'll say to our staff, hey, we're about to do something that's going to get people angry with me. I just know it. I just know that if we make this certain change that somebody's going to be upset. I just know that if I do something in my home, that somebody in my home is going to be upset. I can predict that. That's pretty easy. You can too. You know that if you do something at work, you're going to get fired. If you tell your boss that he shouldn't be in charge, let me just tell you, you're probably going to get fired. That doesn't take a genius to figure that out. Death, I could probably do that too. If I go into a Muslim nation and I begin to publicly walk through the streets and tell people about Jesus Christ, I can predict I'm going to die. I'm not a genius, but I know that's true. I know there are certain places that if I communicate certain messages that I'm going to die. And Jesus, he knows he's going to die. He knows he's going to go into a situation where he's going to begin to speak some things and get people really upset and he's going to die. That doesn't take a genius. But friends, to say when I'm going to come back to life, to say that I am going to come back to life, to say that I know the moment I'm going to come back to life, to be able to have the foreknowledge that something's going to happen, that's more than a man. That's more than somebody with wisdom. You see, if I could tell you that I walked through a Muslim nation and I began to proclaim Jesus Christ, I could tell you that I was going to die. But for me to say in 2.5 days, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I'm going to come back to life, you would think I was out of my mind. You would. But Jesus said 3 days later, 3 days after they put me to death, you're going to go to the tomb and I'm not going to be there. 3 days later, I'm going to come back to life. Oh, Jesus, your claims are audacious. They're only audacious if they're untrue. And 3 days later, when Mary Magdalene goes to the tomb, she finds the tomb empty. 3 days later, when the disciples are upset, hear the message from the women, they run to the tomb and they find that he isn't in there. Friends, my goodness, he proclaims something there's no way any rational individual could know, that he would rise again. New thoughts on resurrection, new thoughts on who Jesus was, and the fact that he predicted his resurrection. I don't know about you, but I've got to be convinced in my heart. I've got to decide on the fact that Jesus Christ isn't in the grave anymore. This isn't an emotional Christianity. This isn't some crutch. This isn't me just being stirred and just a feel-good time. Oh, I just like church because we sing nice songs and I feel good and the people are nice and that preacher looks pretty good. No, it speaks to my mind. What I've shared this morning speaks to my mind. Many of you probably know the story of the emperor's new clothes. This emperor he was pompous emperor. And he wanted some brand new clothes. And so he hired these 2 tailors and he says, I want you to make something that no other king has ever had. And so these 2 tailors were just deceitful individuals, and they concocted this idea that they would put very little effort in, and they would tell the king that he had this brand new outfit that anybody who was foolish could not see. All the unwise and the ignoble people, they could not see. And what they would do is they would simply pretend to put clothes on, and they would let the king appear naked. And so the day of the concluding moment of the garments being done arrived, and here was the king, and so they began to take off his clothes and strip him down, and they began to put on this fake new garment. And they began to put it on, and they acted like, put your arm out, king, and he put his arm out, and they pretend to put on this invisible garment. And they put it all on, and they said, King, look in the mirror. And as the king spun around in the mirror, he was a little amazed because it didn't look like he had any clothes on. He was naked. But he knew that only the noble people, only the unwise people would fail to see the clothes, and so he convinced himself that he had clothes on. He says, now let me show the people my new clothes. And he makes his way out of his bedroom and down the stairs, and all the servants are looking up, but they've heard about this set of clothes, and they don't want to say anything to the king. The king's like, how do you like my new clothes? People are like, your clothes are great, king. his way through his kingdom, and he begins to walk through the streets, and he's parading around buck naked. And people are looking at him, and they can see that he has nothing on, but they know that if they say something that he will have their heads. They know that if they say something that they will be considered unwise and ignoble, and so they say, "That's a beautiful garment you have there, king. That's a great, great garment. That's the best outfit we've ever seen," and they begin to praise him for his new outfit. Person after person seeing the evidence but denying it, until some kid, love kids, "Hey, the king is naked." He looks up and he sees this king with no clothes on, and he doesn't know the rules. He doesn't know that we've got to deceive ourselves, and we've got to proclaim something that doesn't make sense. He simply states what he sees. He states the evidence. The king is naked. We live in a world where Christianity is not popular anymore. And perhaps there's some of you who have pushed off Christianity, and you've bought into the crowd, and you've said things over and over again about Jesus. Jesus can't be alive. He can't be the Son of God. He can't be the King of all eternity. He can't be. But friends, how do you look at the naked king after today? How do you reconcile the things I shared? How do you not, like the little kid, say, "Truly, the king is naked"? How do you not say, "Truly, Jesus is alive"? You see, he wasn't alive when he was taken off the cross. They didn't steal him from the tomb. I told you all the facts about that. Doesn't make sense. They didn't fabricate a story. That there's no possible way that could be the fact. And everything that followed tells me rationally, evidence, that if I would just put away what the crowd says, that Jesus is alive, and if he's alive, he's more than a man, he's the Son of God. He's the Son of God. I'm here today to tell you that Jesus is no longer in the grave. This isn't an emotional appeal, it's a rational appeal, that Jesus is no longer in the grave. He conquered death, and he's alive today. He is alive today. Jesus Christ is alive. Now I want you to bow your heads and close your eyes just for a moment. I pray that those of you who are of faith, that this would firm up some of the things that you have held to for years. But my prayer is that there would be some people in this place who have been pushing off Jesus Christ, not willing to accept him, that today you would say, I've got to grab hold of the evidence. I've got to grab hold of it. He really is the Son of God. He really is alive. And perhaps you're in this place and you've been part of the crowd, just like the story, where you've been buying into what everybody else has been saying about Jesus, but it's time for you to make a decision for yourself. He was alive. He died. He died on a cross. He wasn't alive when they took him off. They didn't steal his body. And there's no possible way the disciples fabricated this. He predicted this was going to happen, friends. And he did it for you. He didn't just die, but he rose again. Mere men can die, but only God can die and come back to life. And so you're in this place and you've never accepted Jesus as your Savior, but you'd say, today, I believe he's alive. I believe he died and he rose again. And I want to serve this Jesus more than man. I want to serve this Jesus who's God. If that's you, would you just raise your hand? No one looking around. You say, I want to give my life to Jesus this morning. I believe. I fully believe. Thank you. Who else? Just raise your hand. Anybody else? I'm going to give you one last chance. So many people in this room have done this. They said, I believe that Jesus rose for me. And you want to do that today, just raise your hand. Anybody else? Thank you, buddy. Thank you. I see your hand. Thank you over on my left. Anybody else? what we're going to do, congregation. Maybe you didn't have the guts to put your hand up. You're a little afraid. There's a number of 100 people in this place. I'm going to say this prayer. I'm going to ask everybody in this congregation to pray it with me. If you believe the words that we're about to say, Jesus Christ will come into your life and totally transform you. So let's pray this together. Dear Jesus, I believe you died for my sins. And today I believe you rose again to give me hope that sin hasn't won, that there is life, and that life is in Jesus Christ. Today I give my life to you. I ask you to forgive me of my sins and be in charge of my life. I want to follow Jesus from this day forward. I ask this in your name. Amen. Amen. Congregation, I'm going to ask you to stand. If you raised your hand and you said that prayer, if you want to just stay behind for a couple minutes, there will be some people at the front who would love to give you material. But friends, as we conclude this service, I pray that more than your heads would be provoked today. I pray that your hearts would be provoked, that Jesus is alive. I mean, when I woke up this morning and my heart was overwhelmed, I thought this is the crux of Christianity, that Jesus is no longer dead, but he's alive and he's well. And we have a reason to celebrate. And we're going to sing this song. We're going to wait for the kids just to come. Pastor Steve's going to lead us in this concluding song. We're going to sing it once or twice, and then I'm going to pray a closing prayer. We want to sing this